The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of my small kitchen, painting soft golden lines across the cracked tiles. I was humming an old tune as I kneaded the dough, the same way I used to when Ethan was a little boy. He loved the smell of freshly baked bread, said it reminded him of home. Back then, home meant love, warmth, and simplicity. Now it was something else entirely. Ethan was coming over for dinner that evening with his wife, Clara. It had been months since I'd last seen them. He'd been busy, he said. Work, parties, obligations, all part of the new life he'd built with Clara. I didn't blame him. I just missed the boy who used to run into my arms after school, smudged with paint and laughter. When they arrived, I noticed immediately how much they didn't belong in my little world anymore. Clara looked stunning, a pearl white dress, polished nails, and that faint air of superiority that followed her like expensive perfume. Ethan stood beside her in a crisp shirt, his arm around her waist, his smile polite but distant. "Mom, this looks cozy," Clara said as she stepped into my modest dining room. Her tone was soft but layered with judgment. I swallowed my pride and smiled. It's not much, but it's home. Dinner was quiet at first, too quiet. I asked Ethan about his job, and he gave short answers. Clara filled the silence, talking about her mother's charity events, her father's company, her family's new vacation home. She spoke as if she was listing trophies. I listened, trying to smile, trying not to feel small. Then it happened, the words that would burn themselves into my memory forever. Clara laughed softly and said, "Ethan, remember when my mom redid our kitchen last year? You said you'd love to have one like hers someday." Ethan chuckled. "Well, yeah, my mother-in-law has great taste. Everything she touches looks classy." I smiled faintly, pretending it didn't hurt. But then he added, almost absent-mindedly, "Mom, you'll never be as good as her. You know how she is, she just has that touch." The room went silent. My hands froze around the spoon I was holding. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. Clara shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing what he'd just said. But Ethan didn't. He kept eating, unaware of the knife his words had just driven into my heart. I forced a smile, my voice trembling. "Then maybe you should ask her to cook for you next time." He laughed it off. "Oh, come on, Mom, don't be dramatic. You know what I mean." But I did know what he meant. He didn't see me as the woman who worked double shifts to keep him in school, who skipped meals so he could have more, who sewed his clothes late into the night. He saw me as ordinary, maybe even embarrassing. When they left later that night, I stood by the door long after their car disappeared. The dishes sat cold and untouched on the table. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old wall clock, the same one I'd bought when Ethan was born. I leaned against the wall, tears silently streaming down my face. I wasn't angry, not yet, just broken. For years I had believed love was enough, that if I gave my all, my son would always understand. But that night I realized something painful. Love can be taken for granted, and even a mother's heart can break beyond repair. I blew out the candle on the table and whispered to the empty room, "Maybe someday, Ethan, you'll understand what you just lost." The air was heavy with the scent of baked bread, bittersweet, just like my heart. Days turned into weeks, yet Ethan's words echoed in my mind like an old wound that refused to heal. "You'll never be as good as my mother-in-law." I tried to shake them off, convincing myself he hadn't meant it the way it sounded, that maybe it was just careless talk. But even the softest insult, when spoken by someone you love, cuts the deepest. I went about my days as usual. Mornings were spent at the bakery where I worked part-time, the same place that had kept us fed when Ethan was young. My hands moved on their own, kneading dough, shaping loaves, brushing butter, but my thoughts were somewhere else. Every time I handed a loaf to a customer, I saw Ethan's face as a little boy, smiling, calling me the best cook in the world. Now that memory felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Ethan rarely called anymore, and when he did, it was out of convenience. "Mom, could you make that stew Clara likes?" Or "Mom, can you drop by and help clean up? We're hosting friends." His tone was polite, distant, the kind people use with acquaintances, not with the woman who raised them. Still, I went, because that's what mothers do. We show up even when our hearts are breaking. Clara's house was a mansion compared to mine. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the faint scent of expensive candles, everything screamed perfection. And yet it all felt cold. Every time I walked in, I felt smaller, like I was intruding in a world that had no place for me. Clara never hid her disdain. She'd smile sweetly. Her words dipped in honey, but sharp enough to draw blood. "Oh, Martha, you didn't have to bring dessert. We have a chef now, you know." Or, "It's so sweet that you still make everything by hand. My mother says time is too precious for that." I'd smile, pretending her comments didn't sting. I'd serve the food, clean up after them, and quietly leave while they laughed together in the living room. One evening, as I was leaving their home, I heard Clara's voice behind me, soft but cruelly clear. "She tries so hard to impress us," she said, laughing. "My mom says it's sad, really." And Ethan laughed too. That was the moment something inside me changed. For years, I had carried the weight of motherhood like a sacred duty, forgiving, loving, sacrificing. But as I stood on their polished doorstep, my heart finally went still. The ache turned into resolve. I realized that the boy I raised was gone, and no amount of love could bring him back. When I returned home, I sat in the quiet of my little kitchen. The same cracked tiles, the same warm smell of bread. It wasn't grand or elegant, but it was real. It was mine. I poured myself a cup of tea and stared at the small stack of savings I'd hidden in a tin box. It wasn't much, just enough to start something of my own. That night, a thought began to grow inside me, slow and steady like the rising dough I baked every morning. I wouldn't beg for love. I wouldn't chase what was no longer mine. Instead, I'd build something stronger, a life that didn't depend on anyone's approval, not even my son's. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. If Ethan ever came back needing me again, my answer wouldn't come from a place of weakness. It would come from the quiet strength of a woman who had finally learned the value of her own worth. And one day, when he came asking for help, I'd give him my answer, the same words he had once forced me to say through tears, then ask her to pay. The thought brought a faint, almost bitter smile to my lips. Revenge wasn't about anger, it was about peace. And mine had just begun to take shape. The months that followed felt strangely calm. For the first time in years, I stopped waiting for Ethan's calls. I stopped hoping he would suddenly remember the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him. I began to live for myself quietly, purposefully. Every morning, I'd rise before dawn, tie my hair back, and bake. What started as a few loaves for neighbors turned into orders. Pies, bread, cookies, all made with the same love I once reserved for my son. Word spread fast in our small town. People started calling me Sweet Martha. I smiled at the nickname. It felt like a new beginning, a second life born from the ashes of my pain. But life has a way of circling back. One gray afternoon, my phone buzzed. I almost didn't recognize the number. It had been so long. When I answered, Ethan's voice trembled on the other end. "Mom." My hands froze over the counter. "Ethan," he exhaled shakily. "Mom, I didn't know who else to call." I could hear something in his voice, desperation, maybe even regret. The sound of it stirred something in my chest I wasn't ready to name. "What happened?" I asked quietly. He hesitated before saying, "Clara's dad's company went bankrupt. Everything's gone, the cars, the house, even our savings. We're drowning in debt." I said nothing. I just listened to the sound of his breathing, heavy, uneven, the sound of a man who had fallen from a great height. "Mom," he continued, his tone softening, "we just need a little help. Maybe you could lend us some money, just until I find work again." I looked around my tiny kitchen, the flour, dusted counters, the handwritten order slips, the smell of cinnamon and sugar lingering in the air. Everything I had built had come from my own 2 hands, without anyone's help, especially his. "Ethan," I said finally, my voice calm but firm, "I don't have much. I know." He said quickly, "But anything helps. She's struggling. I told her you'd understand." I let out a slow breath, feeling a strange peace settle inside me. I thought of that night, the laughter, his words, "You'll never be as good as my mother-in-law." And now here he was, asking the woman who wasn't good enough to save him. A small, almost sad smile touched my lips. "Then ask her to pay," I said quietly. The silence on the other end was heavy. I imagined his face, the shock, the guilt, the realization. "Mom, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I wish I could, Ethan," I said softly, "but I'm not the woman you thought wasn't good enough. I'm the woman who learned her worth after you forgot it." He didn't respond. Just silence, thick, painful, necessary. When the call ended, I stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of years lift from my shoulders. It wasn't joy or pride. I felt it was something deeper. Justice, maybe. Closure. I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft gold and pink. I thought about the little boy I used to know, the one who'd once told me I made the best pies in the world. Somewhere deep down, I hoped he'd remember that not for my sake, but for his. Because someday he would need to understand that money fades, beauty fades, and pride fades, but love, the kind that's given freely and without condition, is something you can't buy back once it's gone. That evening, I went back to baking, my hands steady and sure. The oven hummed softly as I placed another tray inside. The scent of cinnamon filled the air, warm and comforting. Outside, night began to fall, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. My revenge wasn't loud or cruel. It was quiet, it was peaceful, and it was finally mine. A year passed since that call, a year of silence, healing, and quiet triumph. My life had taken a new shape, one molded not by bitterness, but by purpose. What began as a few loaves baked out of habit had blossomed into something beautiful. Sweet Grace Bakery, a small shop at the corner of Maple and Rosewood. The scent of warm bread and sugar drifted through the air each morning, drawing customers like bees to honey. Children pressed their noses against the glass, admiring the golden pies. Elderly neighbors came for coffee and conversation. It wasn't wealth that filled my days, it was peace. Every pie I sold carried a story of sacrifice, of love, of quiet strength. And though my heart still ached sometimes, it no longer bled. I had stitched myself back together, one batch of dough at a time. Then one rainy afternoon, as I wiped down the counter, the doorbell chimed. I turned and froze. Ethan stood there. He looked older, thinner, tired. The confident sparkle that once filled his eyes was gone. Beside him, Clara clung to his arm, her expensive coat soaked, her expression subdued, a shadow of the woman who once sneered at me across my kitchen table. "Mom," Ethan said softly. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The part of me that had once longed for this reunion, for an apology, for understanding, suddenly felt calm. I had already found closure long before this moment. "What brings you here?" I asked gently, wiping my hands on my apron. He looked down, ashamed. We wanted to see you, to say we're sorry." His voice cracked. "You were right, Mom, about everything. When things got bad, no one was there for us. Not Clara's family, not her mother, no one." Clara nodded. tears glistening in her eyes. "We were wrong. I was wrong. I treated you terribly." I looked at her, not with anger, but with quiet compassion. Life has a way of teaching lessons that words never can. I said softly. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "You have every right to hate me, Mom, but I just want you to know I remember now. The nights you stayed up sewing my uniforms, the lunches you packed, the way you always believed in me. I didn't see it before, but now I do." I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to hold him, to tell him it was okay, but I also wanted him to understand that forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It only transforms it. I smiled faintly. "Ethan, I stopped hating you long ago. I just learned to love myself enough not to let anyone make me feel small again." He looked around the bakery, the rows of pies, the cozy lights, the shelves of bread, and whispered, "You did all this by yourself." "Yes," I said. "And every bit of it came from what you once thought wasn't good enough." He bowed his head, tears slipping down his cheeks. Clara reached for my hand, and this time her touch was humble, trembling. "We don't deserve your kindness," she said quietly. "Maybe not," I replied, "but kindness isn't something you earn, it's something you pass on." I turned, cut a slice of warm apple pie, and placed it on a plate. I handed it to Ethan. "Here," I said softly, "it's your favorite." He took it with shaking hands, his eyes glistening. "Mom, thank you." I smiled. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Ethan. It means moving forward and knowing when to let go." The three of us sat for a while in silence, the storm outside tapping gently against the window. For the first time in years, it wasn't a silence filled with pain, but with understanding. When they finally left, I stood by the window and watched them walk away, two broken souls who had finally learned what love truly meant. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled clean, renewed. I looked around my little bakery, feeling the warmth it radiated, the life I had built from the ruins of my heart. My revenge hadn't come through anger or cruelty. It had come through peace, through living well, through finding joy where others expected sorrow. And as I turned the sign on my bakery door to closed, I whispered to the quiet street, "You'll never be as good as my mother-in-law, you said, but I never wanted to be. I only wanted to be me, and that's finally enough." The lights dimmed, the scent of sugar and cinnamon lingered, and for the first time in a long, long time, my heart was free.